The laughter cut through the boarding house like a knife, but Martha Winslow had learned long ago not to flinch. 26 years of mockery had taught her that. What she hadn't learned was what to do when a 7-foot mountain man rose from his corner table, eyes blazing like winter fire, and lifted a 200-pound cowboy off the ground by his throat, all because he'd called her a name she'd heard 1,000 times before. But this time, someone had finally heard it too. Stay with me through this story of courage, redemption, and unexpected love in the wild heart of 1872 Wyoming. Comment below with your city so I can see how far Martha and Elias's story has traveled across the world. The autumn wind that swept through Broken Ridge, Wyoming carried the smell of horse sweat, tobacco smoke, and broken dreams. It was the kind of wind that made men pull their collars tight and women hurry their steps toward home. But for Martha Winslow, there was no hurrying. There never had been. She moved through the back door of Halpern's boarding house with the practiced invisibility of someone who had spent a lifetime trying not to be seen. The basket of laundered linens pressed against her chest, still warm from the afternoon sun, but growing heavier with each step up the narrow staircase. Her breathing came in controlled measures, not from exertion, though the stairs were steep, but from the careful management of sound that had become second nature. If Mrs. Halpern heard heavy footfalls, there would be comments. There were always comments. Martha. The voice cracked through the late afternoon quiet like a whip. Those linens were due an hour ago, Mr. Peterson in room 4 has been asking, and I've had to make excuses for your laziness again. Martha's jaw tightened, but her face remained carefully neutral as she emerged into the second-floor hallway. Constance Halpern stood at the top of the stairs, her thin frame rigid with perpetual disapproval, her graying hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her already pinched features into a permanent expression of distaste. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Halpern," Martha said quietly, her voice carrying the practiced softness of someone who had learned that loud meant noticeable and noticeable meant vulnerable. The wind kept blowing them off the line. I had to rewash 2 of the sheets. Excuses. Mrs. Halpern's lips pressed into a bloodless line. Always excuses. If you moved with any efficiency, the wind wouldn't be a problem. But then efficiency requires a certain lightness of step, doesn't it? The barb landed exactly where it was intended, but Martha's expression didn't change. She'd had 26 years to build her armor, and Mrs. Halpern's cruelty, while constant, had long since lost its ability to pierce the deepest parts of her. The words still hurt. They always hurt. But Martha had learned to let them hit the surface and slide away like rain on oiled canvas. "I'll deliver these right away," Martha murmured, moving past her employer toward Mr. Peterson's room. "See that you do. And Martha!" Mrs. Halpern's voice stopped her mid-step. "Supper service begins in an hour. I expect you presentable. That means a clean apron and your hair properly pinned. I won't have you looking like something dragged in from the plains while we have paying customers to serve." "Yes, ma'am." Martha distributed the linens quickly, her movements efficient despite what Mrs. Halpern believed. She'd been working at the boarding house for 8 years since she was 18, and her mother had died leaving her with no family and fewer prospects. In those 8 years, she'd learned every corner of the establishment, every creaking floorboard to avoid every shadow to slip into when the boarders got rowdy or cruel. The boarding house itself was a 3-story structure that had seen better days. Its paint peeled in long strips, revealing weathered wood beneath. The front porch sagged slightly on the left side, and the sign that proclaimed Halpern's Boarding House, clean rooms, fair prices, swung crookedly on rusty chains. But in a town like Broken Ridge, where the railroad hadn't yet arrived and most men slept in bunkhouses or bedrolls, it was considered a respectable establishment. Martha's room was on the 3rd floor, barely large enough for a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small trunk that held everything she owned. She changed her apron and repinned her dark blonde hair, studying her reflection in the cracked mirror above the washstand with the detached assessment she'd developed over the years. She saw what everyone else saw, a woman too large for the standards of beauty that governed her world. Her face was round, her body heavy, her movements careful and measured to take up as little space as possible. But there were things the mirror didn't show: the strength in her arms from years of hauling water and laundry, the sharpness in her gray eyes that noticed everything, the intelligence that had taught her to read by candlelight using newspapers left behind by boarders. None of that mattered in Broken Ridge. Here she was, simply that fat girl who works at Halpern's. Not Martha. Not a person with thoughts and dreams and a heart that still against all odds hoped for something more than this endless cycle of work and humiliation. The dining room was already filling when Martha descended the back stairs into the kitchen. Mrs. Halpern was at the stove, ladling stew into bowls with mechanical precision while muttering under her breath about the cost of beef and the laziness of hired help. "Start serving," she barked without looking up. "And mind you don't spill. Last week you got gravy on Mr. Hendricks's coat, and I had to comp his room for the night." Martha didn't bother pointing out that Mr. Hendricks had deliberately stuck his foot out as she passed, causing her to stumble. Mrs. Halpern knew. She'd been standing right there. But Martha was expendable, and Mr. Hendricks paid his rent on time. The dining room was loud with male voices and the clatter of utensils. Most of the boarders were ranch hands, trappers, or drifters passing through on their way to somewhere else. They sat at the long communal tables, elbows sprawled, hats pushed back, talking in the rough, easy manner of men who spent most of their time outdoors and considered indoor manners an unnecessary refinement. Martha moved between the tables with her tray setting down bowls of stew and plates of cornbread, making herself as inconspicuous as possible. It was a skill she'd perfected, the art of being present, but not seen there, but not noticed. "Well, look here," a voice drawled as she approached one of the tables. "The house is feeding us well tonight. Plenty of beef in this stew and plenty of—" "Shut up, Dalton," another man interrupted with a laugh. "Don't be crude." But the damage was done. Laughter rippled across the table, and Martha felt her face heat despite her best efforts. She set down the bowls without meeting anyone's eyes and turned to retreat to the kitchen. "Now don't go getting offended," Dalton called after her, his voice carrying across the room. "I'm just saying Mrs. Halpern feeds us good. A man could get used to this kind of abundance." More laughter. Martha's hands trembled as she pushed through the kitchen door, but she forced herself to breathe slowly, steadily. This was nothing new. This was every day. She could handle every day. "What are you doing back here?" Mrs. Halpern demanded. "There are still tables to serve." "Yes, ma'am." Martha reloaded her tray and pushed back through the door. The dining room had grown more crowded in the few minutes she'd been gone. More men had arrived, filling in the empty spaces at the tables, and the noise level had increased accordingly. Martha navigated the narrow spaces between the tables, delivering food, refilling coffee cups, enduring the occasional comment that was just loud enough for her to hear, but quiet enough that it could be denied if challenged. She was refilling a cup for Mr. Henderson, one of the few boarders who treated her with basic courtesy when the front door opened. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The noise level dropped, as if someone had thrown a blanket over the room. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. Even Mrs. Halpern, who rarely emerged from the kitchen during meal service, appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron and frowning at the disruption. The man who stood in the doorway had to duck to clear the frame. He was enormous, not fat, but tall, and broad-shouldered in a way that suggested raw power barely contained. His hair was dark and long, pulled back from a face that was all hard angles and weathered skin. A scar ran from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone, pulling that eye slightly downward and giving him a permanently fierce expression. He wore buckskin trousers and a heavy coat that looked like it had been stitched together from various animal hides. A rifle was slung across his back and a knife hung from his belt. But it was his eyes that held Martha's attention. They were pale gray, almost silver, and they swept across the room with the careful assessment of a predator evaluating potential threats. "We don't allow weapons in the dining room," Mrs. Halpern announced, her voice sharp with authority. The man's gaze shifted to her, and something in his expression made the boarding house proprietor take an involuntary step backward. "I'm not here for trouble," he said. His voice was deep and quiet, but it carried easily in the silent room. "Just a meal and a room for the night if you have one." Mrs. Halpern hesitated, clearly torn between her rules and the money a paying customer represented. Money won as it usually did. "Weapons stay by the door," she said firmly, "and payment in advance." The man unslung his rifle and leaned it carefully against the wall beside the door. He removed his knife and set it beside the rifle. Then he pulled a leather pouch from his coat and extracted several coins, which he placed in Mrs. Halpern's outstretched palm. She examined them bit one to test its authenticity and nodded curtly. Room 7, third floor. The girl will show you after you eat. Martha. Get this gentleman seated and fed. Martha had been frozen in place, coffee pot still in hand, but Mrs. Halpern's bark jolted her back to motion. She set the pot down and approached the stranger, acutely aware that every eye in the room was on them. This way, please, she murmured, leading him toward an empty table in the corner as far from the other diners as possible. The man followed her, his footsteps surprisingly quiet for someone his size. He folded himself into the chair, which looked comically small beneath him, and waited patiently as Martha returned to the kitchen for his meal. That's Elias Greywood, she heard someone whisper as she passed. The mountain man. They say he killed a grizzly with just a knife. I heard he killed a man the same way, another voice added, up in the high country over a trapline dispute. I heard he's half crazy, lives alone in the mountains, talks to wolves. Martha blocked out the whispers and focused on loading the tray. Her hands were steadier now. Something about the stranger's quiet presence had calmed her, though she couldn't have explained why. Maybe it was simply that his arrival had shifted everyone's attention away from her. When she returned to his table, he looked up and met her eyes directly, not through her, not past her, but at her as if she were a person worth seeing. It was such a rare occurrence that Martha nearly dropped the bowl of stew. Thank you, he said as she set down his food. You're welcome. Can I get you anything else? Coffee, water? Coffee would be good. Martha returned with the coffee pot and filled his cup. He wrapped his large hands around it, and she noticed they were scarred and calloused, the hands of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with them. It's good to be indoors, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Weather's changing early this year. Martha wasn't sure if she was supposed to respond, but something in his tone suggested he was simply making an observation rather than demanding conversation. She nodded and turned to leave. What's your name? The question stopped her. She turned back, surprised. Martha, sir. Martha Winslow. Elias Greywood. He extended his hand. Martha stared at it for a moment, confused. No one shook her hand. No one had touched her voluntarily in longer than she could remember, except to shove her aside or grab her wrist to complain about something. But his hand remained outstretched, patient, waiting. She placed her hand in his. His grip was firm but gentle, his palm warm and rough against her softer skin. The handshake lasted exactly the appropriate amount of time. Not too brief, not too long, and when he released her hand, Martha felt as though something significant had just occurred, though she couldn't have said what. Thank you for the meal, Martha Winslow, he said. It's the first hot food I've had in 3 weeks. You're welcome, Mr. Greywood. She retreated to the kitchen, her heart beating faster than it should. Behind her, the dining room noise had gradually resumed, though at a lower volume than before. Men were still watching Elias Greywood, still whispering about him, but with a wary respect rather than mockery. The rest of the meal service passed in a blur. Martha moved through her duties automatically, but her mind kept returning to the stranger in the corner. He ate slowly, methodically, his attention focused on his food rather than the whispers swirling around him. When he finished, he set his napkin beside his empty bowl and rose, moving toward the kitchen door. Martha met him there, wiping her hands on her apron. I'll show you to your room. I'd appreciate that. They climbed the stairs in silence, the second floor, then the third, where the ceiling sloped under the eaves, and the hallway was barely wide enough for one person, let alone someone of Elias Greywood's size. Martha unlocked room 7 and pushed open the door. It's not much, she said apologetically. The room was tiny, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair. But the linens are clean and there's fresh water in the pitcher. It's more than I usually have. Elias set his pack down beside the bed. Thank you, Martha. There it was again, her name spoken as if it mattered. As if she mattered. If you need anything, just let Mrs. Halpern know, Martha said, backing toward the door. Wait. Elias opened his pack and rummaged inside. I wanted to give you something, for your kindness. Oh no, sir, that's not necessary. But he'd already pulled out a cloth bundle which he unfolded to reveal a collection of mushrooms, golden chanterelles, their distinctive frilly edges and earthy smell immediately recognizable. Found these this afternoon on my way into town, Elias said. Too many for one person. Thought maybe you could use them. They're good fried up with a little butter if you have it, or dried for winter stew. Martha stared at the mushrooms, then at him, then back at the mushrooms. No one had ever given her a gift, not in her entire adult life. She didn't know what to say. Thank you, she finally managed, her voice thick. That's very kind. You were kind first, Elias said simply. Seemed fair to return it. He placed the cloth bundle in her hands, and for a moment their fingers brushed. Martha felt that strange jolt again, that sense of something shifting in the foundations of her carefully controlled world. Good night, Mr. Greywood. Good night, Martha Winslow. Martha descended the stairs in a daze, the mushrooms clutched to her chest. When she reached the kitchen, Mrs. Halpern took one look at her and frowned. What's that you've got? Mushrooms, ma'am. Mr. Greywood gave them to me. Gave them to you. Mrs. Halpern's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Why would he do that? I don't know, ma'am. He just said they were for my kindness. Mrs. Halpern made a dismissive sound in her throat. Well, don't go getting ideas. Men like that don't give gifts without expecting something in return. You mark my words, girl. He'll be wanting something before he leaves. Yes, ma'am. But Martha didn't believe it. Something in Elias Greywood's eyes had been different. He'd looked at her the way her mother used to, as if she were a valuable, worthy human. She tucked the mushrooms into a pocket of her apron and returned to the dining room to clear the tables. The other boarders had mostly finished eating and were settling into their evening rituals card games. Whiskey. The endless retelling of stories that grew more dramatic with each iteration. Martha moved between the tables, stacking dishes on her tray, trying to be invisible again. But invisibility was proving elusive tonight. Hey, fat girl. The voice belonged to Dalton the ranch hand who'd made the comment earlier. He was sitting at a table with 3 other men, all of them flushed with drink and stupid with the kind of courage that came from a bottle. Come here a minute. Martha kept her head down and continued clearing. I'm talking to you. Dalton's voice rose, drawing attention from the other tables. Don't ignore me. Leave her alone, Dalton, someone said wearily. You've had enough. I haven't had near enough. Dalton shoved back from the table and stood swaying slightly. He was a big man himself, thick through the chest and shoulders, with the kind of meanness that liked to find smaller, weaker targets. I want to ask her something. Martha's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to keep moving to finish clearing the table she was working on. If she could just get back to the kitchen, but Dalton was faster than his drunken state suggested. He crossed the room and grabbed her arm, spinning her around to face him. The dishes on her tray clattered and one bowl crashed to the floor, shattering. When I call you, you answer, Dalton said, his face inches from hers. His breath reeked of whiskey and tobacco. You understand me, fat girl. I'm sorry, Martha whispered. I didn't mean... Sorry, Dalton laughed, looking around at his companions for approval. She's sorry, boys. But here's what I want to know. How does a girl as big as you get any work done? I mean, you must spend half your time just eating, ain't that right? Where does Mrs. Halpern even find aprons that fit around all that? The rest of his sentence disappeared into a choking sound. Martha blinked, confused. Dalton was still in front of her, but he was no longer standing on the floor. Instead, he was suspended in the air, his feet dangling, his hands clawing at the massive fist that gripped his throat. Elias Greywood had moved so fast and so silently that no one had seen him coming. One moment he wasn't there, the next he was lifting Dalton off the ground as easily as a child might lift a doll. Apologize, Elias said. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the stunned silence like a blade. Dalton's face was turning purple. His mouth worked, but no sound came out except a thin wheeze. Mr. Greywood, Martha began, but Elias's cold gray eyes shifted to her and she fell silent. This man insulted you, Elias said. That requires an apology. Don't you think? Martha didn't know what she thought. She'd never had anyone defend her before. The experience was so foreign, so completely outside her understanding of how the world worked that she couldn't process it. He's drunk, she managed. He doesn't know what he's saying. He knows exactly what he's saying. Elias returned his attention to Dalton, who was still struggling in his grip. And he's going to apologize. Aren't you? Dalton nodded frantically, his face now nearly crimson. Elias lowered him until his feet touched the floor but didn't release his throat. "Say it." Dalton gasped for air. "I'm sorry." "To her, not to me." Dalton's wild eyes found Martha's. "I'm sorry, Martha. I'm sorry I didn't mean nothing by it." "That's a lie," Elias said calmly. "You meant exactly what you said. But you won't say it again, will you?" No, I swear." "Good." Elias released him, and Dalton collapsed to his knees, coughing and gasping. "Because if I hear that you've bothered this woman again, if I hear that you've even looked at her wrong, I'll come back, and next time I won't be so gentle. Understand?" Dalton nodded, still coughing, his hands massaging his throat. Elias turned to survey the rest of the room. His gaze moved from face to face, and grown men looked away, suddenly fascinated by their cards or their whiskey or the grain pattern in the wooden tables. "Anyone else want to share their thoughts about Miss Winslow?" Elias asked quietly. Silence. "Good." He looked down at Martha, and his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Are you all right?" Martha opened her mouth closed. It opened it again. She felt as though she were standing outside her own body, watching this scene unfold from a great distance. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to her. People didn't defend her. People didn't risk confrontation on her behalf. People didn't see her at all except as an object of ridicule or a body to perform labor. Yes, she finally whispered. "I'm all right." "Good." Elias turned back to the room at large. "This woman works hard to feed you and keep you comfortable. The least you can do is treat her with respect. If you can't manage that, maybe you should find somewhere else to board." With that, he turned and walked back up the stairs, his heavy footsteps fading as he climbed toward the third floor. The silence that followed his departure was profound. Martha stood frozen, the tray still in her hands, the broken bowl at her feet, her mind struggling to understand what had just happened. Mrs. Halpern's voice shattered the spell. "Martha Kitchen, now." Martha set down the tray with trembling hands and hurried to obey. Mrs. Halpern was standing by the stove, her face flushed with anger, her thin body vibrating with indignation. "What did you do?" she demanded. "I did nothing, ma'am. You caused a scene. That man nearly killed a paying customer because of you. I didn't ask him to. Don't talk back to me." Mrs. Halpern's hand cracked across Martha's cheek, the sound sharp in the small kitchen. "I warned you about getting ideas. I warned you that men like that always want something, and now look what you've done." Martha touched her cheek, feeling the sting tasting blood where she'd bitten her tongue. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the injustice of the accusation. She hadn't done anything. She'd just been trying to work, trying to be invisible, trying to survive another day in a world that had made it clear she wasn't welcome. "I'm sorry," she whispered, because that's what Mrs. Halpern wanted to hear. "You should be. Now get out there and clean up that mess and then get to bed. And tomorrow morning your wages are being docked for the broken bowl and the disturbance you caused." "Yes, ma'am." Martha returned to the dining room on shaking legs. The men were talking again, but in hushed voices, and she felt their eyes following her as she swept up the broken ceramic and finished clearing the tables. Dalton had disappeared back to his room, probably to nurse his bruised throat and wounded pride. When the last dish was washed and dried, when the tables were wiped down and the floor swept, Martha finally climbed the back stairs to her tiny third-floor room. She was exhausted, her cheeks still stinging, her mind churning with the events of the evening. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside and the settling sounds of the old building. Her fingers found the cloth bundle of mushrooms which she'd placed on the small table beside her bed. She could smell their earthy scent even through the fabric. Someone had defended her. Someone had seen her being hurt and had stopped it. Someone had called her Miss Winslow instead of Fat Girl, or The Help, or any of the other things people called her. Martha turned on her side and pulled her thin blanket up to her chin. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the window panes, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled at the rising moon. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, allowed herself to cry not from sadness or shame, but from something she couldn't quite name. It felt like grief, but also like relief. Like the cracking open of something that had been sealed shut for so long she'd forgotten it was there. In the morning, she would face Mrs. Halpern's anger and the reduced wages. She would endure the whispers and the sideways glances from the other boarders. She would go back to being invisible, to shrinking herself down, to surviving. But tonight, just for tonight, Martha Winslow let herself remember what it felt like to be defended, to be seen, to matter. And somewhere 2 floors below, Elias Greywood lay in his narrow bed, staring at his own ceiling, thinking about gray eyes that had held more strength than their owner knew, and a quiet voice that said, "Thank you," as if kindness were a miracle instead of a baseline expectation. The wind howled, the building settled, and 2 wounded souls slept under the same roof, neither knowing that their lives had just changed forever. Martha woke before dawn, as she always did, but this morning felt different. The events of the previous night played through her mind like scenes from a play she'd watched, rather than lived through. Elias Greywood's hand on Dalton's throat, the stunned silence in the dining room, the way he'd looked at her afterward, checking if she was all right, as if her well-being actually mattered to someone. She touched her cheek where Mrs. Halpern had slapped her. The skin was still tender, but the pain had faded to a dull ache. That pain she understood. That pain was familiar. It was the other feeling, the strange, unfamiliar warmth that had bloomed in her chest when Elias defended her, that unsettled her. Hope was a dangerous thing for someone in her position. Hope led to disappointment, and disappointment led to the kind of pain that didn't fade with time. The boarding house was still quiet as Martha dressed in the pre-dawn darkness and made her way down to the kitchen. Mrs. Halpern wouldn't arrive for another hour, which gave Martha time to start the breakfast preparations in peace. She built up the fire in the stove, set water to boil, and began mixing biscuit dough. Her hands moving through the familiar motions while her mind wandered. The mushrooms Elias had given her sat on the kitchen counter where she'd placed them last night. In the growing light from the stove, their golden color seemed almost luminous. Martha touched one, gently marveling at its perfect form. She'd seen chanterelles before. Occasionally someone would bring them to sell at the general store, but she'd never owned any herself. They were considered a delicacy, too expensive for someone like her. "You planning to stare at those all morning, or are you actually going to do some work?" Martha jumped, spinning around to find Mrs. Halpern standing in the kitchen doorway, already dressed and severe despite the early hour. Her employer's eyes were cold as they surveyed the kitchen, looking for any sign of laziness or incompetence. "I was just about to start the bacon, ma'am," Martha said, quickly moving toward the icebox. "See that you do." "And Martha, about last night." Mrs. Halpern's voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "That mountain man will be leaving today, and when he does, things go back to normal. You understand, whatever foolish notions you might have gotten into your head, you put them right back out. Men like that don't defend women like you out of kindness. They do it for sport or for show, or because they're looking for something in return. And when they don't get it, they move on and forget you ever existed." "Yes, ma'am." Martha kept her voice neutral, her face blank, giving Mrs. Halpern nothing to latch onto. "Your wages are docked $15 for the broken bowl and the disturbance. That's coming out of this month's pay." $15 was nearly half of what Martha earned in a month. It was a crushing blow, but she'd expected it. Mrs. Halpern never let an opportunity for punishment pass unused. "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Now get to work. We have a full house to feed." The morning meal service passed in tense silence. The boarders filtered down in groups of 2 and 3, filling the dining room with the usual sounds of male conversation and clattering cutlery, but there was a new undercurrent of wariness. Men who usually sprawled across the tables sat up straighter. The crude jokes and loud laughter were subdued. And when Martha moved between the tables serving food, no one said a word to her. Not even the usual gruff demands for more coffee or extra bacon. She was refilling Mr. Henderson's cup when Elias descended the stairs. The room didn't fall silent this time, but conversations definitely quieted. Men glanced up, registered his presence, and quickly returned their attention to their plates. Elias took the same corner table he'd occupied the night before. Martha brought him coffee without being asked, setting the cup down gently beside his plate. "Good morning," he said, and his voice held the same quiet courtesy as the previous evening. "Good morning, Mr. Greywood. I'll bring your breakfast in just a moment." "No rush. I'm not in any hurry." Martha returned to the kitchen where Mrs. Halpern was already preparing his plate with aggressive efficiency, slapping bacon and eggs and biscuits onto the china with more force than necessary. "Here." She thrust the plate at Martha. "And don't linger at his table. Serve him and move on. Yes, ma'am. But when Martha set the plate in front of Elias, he looked up at her with those pale gray eyes and said, "Join me for a minute." It wasn't really a question despite the phrasing. It was an invitation offered with the kind of gentle firmness that suggested he wouldn't be offended if she refused, but would be pleased if she accepted. Martha glanced back toward the kitchen where Mrs. Halpern stood in the doorway with her arms crossed watching. Her expression promised retribution, but Martha found she didn't care. For 8 years she'd followed every rule, swallowed every insult, accepted every punishment. And where had it gotten her? She was still invisible, still mocked, still treated as something less than human. "Just for a minute," Martha said, and sat down across from him. Elias smiled a small expression that softened his scarred face and made him look almost gentle. "How are you this morning, after last night, I mean?" "I'm fine, thank you for asking." "And your employer?" "She didn't give you too much trouble, I hope?" Martha hesitated. She wasn't used to honesty, especially not with strangers. But something about Elias invited truth the way a hearth invited cold travelers. "She docked my wages," Martha admitted quietly. $15 for the broken bowl and the disturbance. Elias's expression darkened. His jaw tightened, and for a moment Martha saw the same dangerous intensity that had filled his eyes when he'd grabbed Dalton. "That's not right," he said flatly. "You didn't break that bowl. That drunk fool scared you into dropping it. And the disturbance was my doing, not yours." "It doesn't matter. Mrs. Halpern sees it differently." "It matters." Elias reached into his coat and pulled out his leather pouch. He counted out $15 in coins and bills and pushed them across the table toward Martha. "Here. This should cover what she took from you." Martha stared at the money, her heart hammering. It was too much. It was inappropriate. It would give Mrs. Halpern exactly the ammunition she needed to paint Martha as the kind of woman who accepted payment from men for favors rendered. "I can't take that," Martha whispered. "Why not?" "Because—" She struggled to find words that wouldn't sound like an accusation. "Because people will think things, wrong things." Elias studied her for a long moment, and Martha had the unsettling feeling that he could see straight through her carefully constructed defenses to the fear beneath. "You're worried about your reputation," he said finally. "I'm worried about keeping my job. It's the only thing standing between me and—" Martha trailed off, unwilling to finish the sentence. "Between you and what?" "Nothing. I'm sorry I shouldn't have said anything. Thank you for the offer, but I can't accept." Martha started to rise, but Elias's next words stopped her. "I'm leaving today, heading back up into the mountains before the first snow falls. But I wanted to ask you something first." Martha sat back down slowly. "What?" "Come with me." The words hung in the air between them, so unexpected that Martha was certain she'd misheard. "What? Come with me?" Elias repeated, his voice calm and steady, as if he were proposing something perfectly reasonable instead of completely insane. "Up into the mountains. I could use help with the winter preparations, smoking meat, gathering mushrooms, and herbs, getting the cabin ready. I'd pay you fair wages, better than what you're making here, and I'd treat you with respect, which seems to be in short supply in this establishment." Martha's mind reeled. She opened her mouth closed. It opened it again. "Mr. Greywood, we don't even know each other. You can't just, that's not—" "I know." Elias held up a hand. "I know it sounds strange, but hear me out. I've been watching you since I got here, and I see someone who's smart and capable and hardworking. Someone who deserves better than being treated like dirt by people who should know better. I'm offering you an opportunity. Not charity, not anything else. Just honest work for honest pay and a chance to spend a winter somewhere you won't be insulted every time you turn around." "You don't know me," Martha repeated, but her voice was weaker now, tinged with something that might have been longing. "I know enough. I know you're kind. You were kind to me when most people in this town look at me like I'm a monster. I know you're strong enough to endure years of cruelty without breaking. And I know you deserve a chance at something different." Elias leaned forward slightly. "I'm not asking you to marry me or become my mistress or anything like that. I'm asking if you want a job. A real job where you're valued for your work instead of mocked for your appearance. Think about it. Martha's throat was tight. She wanted to say yes. God help her. She wanted to say yes so badly it hurt. But years of caution, of protecting herself, of expecting the worst because the worst always came, held her tongue. I need to think, she managed. Fair enough. I'll be at the stable getting my horse ready. If you decide you want to come meet me there before noon, if not, no hard feelings. But Martha? He waited until she met his eyes. You're better than this place. I hope you know that. He stood, placed money on the table for his meal, and walked out of the dining room without looking back. The other boarders watched him go, then slowly their attention shifted to Martha, who sat frozen at the empty table, her mind spinning. Mrs. Halpern appeared at her elbow, like a vengeful ghost. Get back to work, she hissed. And whatever that man said to you, the answer is no. You hear me? No. Martha rose on shaking legs and returned to the kitchen. She moved through the rest of the breakfast service in a daze, serving food, clearing plates, washing dishes. Her hands performed the familiar tasks while her mind wrestled with Elias's offer. It was insane. It was dangerous. It was the kind of thing that ruined women's reputations and left them worse off than before. Going into the mountains alone with a strange man, a man rumored to have killed other men, was the height of foolishness. No one would understand. No one would believe it was innocent. She'd be branded a whore, a fallen woman ruined beyond redemption. But another part of her mind, a part that had been silent for so long she'd almost forgotten it existed, whispered different words. What reputation did she have to protect? What future was she safeguarding? 8 years at the boarding house, and what did she have to show for it? A tiny room, a handful of coins saved beneath her mattress, and a daily serving of humiliation. Was that worth protecting? Was that life? Martha? Mrs. Halpern's voice cut through her thoughts. Mr. Peterson says there's a stain on his sheets. Get up there and check. Yes, ma'am. Martha climbed the stairs to the second floor, her legs heavy with exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical effort. She found Mr. Peterson's room and examined the sheets. There was no stain. There never was. It was just an excuse to make her work harder to remind her of her place. She was stripping the bed anyway because contradicting a paying customer was grounds for dismissal when she heard voices from the room next door. The walls were thin and the speakers weren't bothering to keep their voices down. Saw them talking this morning? Bold as brass, sitting right there in the dining room. You think she's stupid enough to go with him? I think she's desperate enough. Woman like that, no prospects, no future. A man shows her a little attention, she'll follow him anywhere. Poor bastard probably just feels sorry for her. Imagine having to look at that every day. Laughter cruel and casual. Martha's hand stilled on the sheets. She stood there listening to two men she'd served breakfast not an hour ago discuss her as if she were a curiosity, a joke, a thing rather than a person. Give it a week. He'll come riding back into town, probably leave her somewhere along the trail. Or maybe she'll wise up and come crawling back here begging for her job back. Mrs. Halpern won't take her back. You know how she is about reputation. So either way, we've seen the last of the fat girl. Can't say I'll miss her. More laughter. Martha finished stripping the bed with mechanical precision, bundled the sheets, and left the room. She walked down the hallway, down the stairs, through the kitchen where Mrs. Halpern was barking orders at the cook, and out the back door into the weak October sunlight. She stood in the yard, breathing deeply, the bundled sheets still in her arms. The air smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves and the approaching winter. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of the town hammers on wood horses on the main street, the distant whistle of the afternoon train that passed through twice a week. This was her life. This was all her life would ever be unless she chose something different. Martha dropped the sheets in the laundry basket and walked back into the kitchen. Mrs. Halpern looked up from her account books, her expression suspicious. Where do you think you're going? To get my things, Martha said, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears, calm, clear, decided. Your things? What are you talking about? I'm leaving Mrs. Halpern. I quit. The words seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Mrs. Halpern stood so quickly her chair scraped against the floor with a screech that made Martha's teeth ache. You can't quit. I have a full house and no other help. You have obligations, girl, contractual obligations. I have no contract. You told me that yourself when you docked my wages last month. You said I was employed at will and that I could be dismissed without notice or cause. That means I can also leave without notice or cause. Mrs. Halpern's face flushed deep red. You ungrateful little, after everything I've done for you, I gave you a job when no one else would. I gave you a roof over your head. You gave me a closet and starvation wages in exchange for 16-hour workdays and constant abuse. I'm grateful for the roof, Mrs. Halpern, but I'm done with the abuse. This is about that mountain man, isn't it? You're going to run off with him like some kind of what? Martha interrupted, and the anger that had been building for 8 years, for 26 years, for her entire life suddenly surged up and spilled over. Like some kind of woman who wants to be treated with basic human decency. Yes, Mrs. Halpern, that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm going to work for someone who sees me as a person instead of a target for cruelty. You'll regret this. You'll come crawling back here within a week and I won't take you back. You'll end up on the street or worse. Is that what you want? What I want, Martha said, and she was surprised by how steady her voice was, is to stop being afraid. What I want is to spend one day, just one single day, without someone making me feel worthless. If that means taking a risk, then I'm taking it. I'd rather fail trying something new than succeed at surviving this. She turned and walked out of the kitchen before Mrs. Halpern could respond. Behind her, she heard her employer's voice rising in volume, calling her back, threatening her, but Martha kept walking. Up the back stairs, up to the 3rd floor, into her tiny room that had been her entire world for 8 years. It took her less than 10 minutes to pack. She didn't have much, a few changes of clothes. Her mother's Bible, the money she'd saved, hidden beneath the mattress, and the bundle of mushrooms Elias had given her. Everything fit into a small carpet bag that had belonged to her mother. Martha stood in the center of the room for one last moment, looking at the narrow bed, the cracked mirror, the water-stained ceiling. How many nights had she lain here staring at those stains, wondering if this was all her life would ever be? How many mornings had she woken in this room with her body aching from work and her heart aching from loneliness? She picked up her bag and walked out without looking back. The boarding house was in an uproar. Martha could hear Mrs. Halpern in the dining room complaining loudly to anyone who would listen about ungrateful employees and the decline of moral standards in young women today. Some of the boarders had gathered, drawn by the commotion, and they watched as Martha descended the stairs with her bag. That's her, someone said. She's really doing it. Fool girl, another voice added. She'll regret it. But Martha didn't pause, didn't respond, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her doubt. She walked straight through the dining room, past Mrs. Halpern's red face and pointed finger, past the gawking boarders, and out the front door into the street. The morning had warmed slightly, though the wind still carried winter's promise. Martha pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and turned toward the stable at the edge of town. Each step felt momentous, as if she were walking not just across Broken Ridge, but across some invisible threshold between the life she'd known and a future she couldn't imagine. People stared as she passed. Word traveled fast in a small town, and it seemed everyone had already heard about the fat girl from the boarding house who was running off with the mountain man. Mrs. Crenshaw, the minister's wife, actually crossed the street to avoid walking near her. Mr. Jessup, who ran the general store, shook his head sadly, as if witnessing a tragedy unfold. Let them stare. Let them judge. Martha had spent her entire life trying to make herself acceptable to people who would never accept her. She was done. The stable sat at the far end of Main Street, a weathered building that smelled of hay and horses and leather. Martha pushed open the door and stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dimmer interior. Elias was in the back, saddling a huge roan horse that looked as wild and untamed as its owner. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression shifted surprise perhaps, or maybe relief. I thought about it, Martha said, and her voice only shook a little. And I'd like to accept your offer, if it's still available. Elias studied her for a long moment, and Martha had the sense he was measuring her, somehow weighing her resolve. Finally, he nodded. It's still available, but I need to know you understand what you're agreeing to. It won't be easy. The cabin is a full day's ride into the mountains. There's no town nearby, no neighbors, no one to run to if things get difficult. The work is hard, and winter in the high country is brutal. You'd be isolated from everything and everyone you know. I understand. And I need you to understand something else. Elias's voice was serious, almost stern. I'm offering you work, Martha. Not marriage, not romance, not anything beyond honest employment. I have a spare room in the cabin where you can sleep. You'll have privacy and safety and respect. But if you're coming with me hoping for something more, you should know that's not what I'm offering. At least not right now. I'm not in a place where I can offer that to anyone. Martha felt her face heat, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. I'm not looking for romance, Mr. Greywood. I'm looking for a chance to be treated like a human being. If you're offering that, then I'm accepting. Elias's expression softened. Then we have an agreement. But you should call me Elias. Mr. Greywood sounds like you're talking to someone else. Elias? Martha repeated, testing the name. And you should call me Martha. Just Martha. Just Martha. He smiled slightly, then turned back to his horse. Do you know how to ride? Not really. I've been on a horse a few times, but you'll learn. We'll take it slow today. He gestured to a smaller mare in the next stall, a gentle-looking brown horse with kind eyes. That's Molly. She's even-tempered and patient. She'll treat you right while you're learning. He saddled Molly with quick, efficient movements, explaining what he was doing as he worked. Martha watched and listened, trying to absorb as much information as possible. When both horses were ready, Elias led them out into the yard behind the stable, away from the main street, and curious eyes. Put your foot here, he instructed, holding his hands together to give her a boost. Then swing your other leg over. Don't worry, I've got you. It took 3 tries and 1 near fall before Martha managed to get herself into the saddle. The ground seemed much farther away than she'd expected, and the mare shifted beneath her, making her grip the saddle horn with white knuckles. Relax, Elias said, adjusting the stirrups to fit her shorter legs. Molly can sense your fear. The more tense you are, the more nervous she'll be. Take a deep breath. That's it. Now just sit with her for a minute. Get used to the feeling. Martha breathed slowly, consciously, relaxing her death grip on the saddle. Molly stood patiently, occasionally turning her head to look back at her new rider with what Martha could have sworn was curiosity. Good, Elias said. He swung onto his own horse with the easy grace of someone who'd been riding since childhood. We'll start slow, just a walk. Trust Molly, she knows what she's doing. They rode out of town at a slow walk, Elias in the lead on his big roan Martha, following on the gentle mare. Martha didn't look back at Broken Ridge, didn't allow herself to second-guess or wonder or doubt. She kept her eyes forward, focused on the trail ahead, and the broad back of the man who'd offered her a second chance. Behind them, the town buzzed with scandal. Martha Winslow, the fat girl from Halpern's boarding house, had run off with the mountain man. The story would grow in the telling. By evening, she'd be pregnant. By tomorrow, she'd have stolen money from Mrs. Halpern. By next week, she'd have seduced Elias with shameless behavior. The truth didn't matter. It never did. But Martha was beyond caring. For the first time in her life, she was choosing her own path. For the first time in her life, she was moving towards something instead of just enduring. The future was uncertain, maybe even dangerous, but it was hers. And that made all the difference. The trail climbed steadily away from Broken Ridge, winding through stands of pine and aspen that glowed gold in the afternoon light. Martha's thighs already ached from gripping the saddle, and her hands were cramping from holding the reins too tightly, but she didn't complain. Complaining felt like something the old Martha would have done, the woman who apologized for existing, who made herself small and quiet to avoid drawing attention. This new version of herself, the one who had walked away from 8 years of certainty into complete uncertainty, needed to be braver than that. Elias rode ahead, his posture relaxed in the saddle, occasionally glancing back to check on her progress. He hadn't said much since they'd left town, seeming content to let the silence stretch between them. Martha appreciated that. Her mind was too full of what she'd done, what she'd left behind, what might lie ahead to make easy conversation. They'd been riding for perhaps 2 hours when Elias raised his hand and brought his horse to a stop. Martha pulled back on Molly's reins too hard, making the mare toss her head in protest, and managed to halt beside him. "We'll rest here," Elias said, swinging down from his horse with easy grace. "Let the animals drink, stretch our legs." He moved to help Martha dismount, his large hands steadying her as she awkwardly climbed down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground and Elias caught her elbow. "First time's always the hardest," he said. "Tomorrow you'll be sore in places you didn't know you had places, but it gets easier." "I hope so," Martha said, trying to walk normally despite the stiffness in her legs. "I feel like I've been folded in half." Elias smiled slightly and led both horses to a small stream that cut across the trail. Martha followed, grateful for the chance to move to feel solid ground beneath her feet again. She knelt by the stream and splashed cold water on her face, washing away the dust of travel and some of the exhaustion. "Are you hungry?" Elias asked, pulling a cloth-wrapped package from his saddlebag. "I've got some jerky and hardtack. Not fancy, but it'll keep your strength up." They sat on a fallen log beside the stream, sharing the simple meal in companionable silence. The jerky was tough and salty, the hardtack nearly hard enough to break teeth, but Martha had eaten worse. She chewed slowly, watching the play of light on the water, listening to the sound of the horses drinking and the wind moving through the pines. "Can I ask you something?" Martha said finally, wiping crumbs from her fingers. "You can ask. Can't promise I'll answer, but you can ask." "Why did you defend me in the boarding house? You didn't know me. I was just someone serving you dinner, but you risked making enemies in that town for my sake. Why?" Elias was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the stream. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, rougher, as if the words were being pulled from somewhere deep inside him. "I had a wife once," he said. "Sarah. She was small and pretty and kind, everything the world thinks a woman should be. We had a daughter too. Emma. She was 3 years old with her mother's dark hair and laugh." Martha's breath caught. She heard the past tense, understood what it meant. "We lived in a valley east of here," Elias continued. "Good land near a settlement called Miller's Creek. I was a blacksmith then, not a trapper. Had a forge, made a decent living. We were happy." He paused, his jaw working. Then one winter sickness came through. Scarlet fever. It took Emma first, then Sarah 3 days later. I buried them both under the oak tree behind our cabin. "I'm so sorry," Martha whispered. "After they died, I couldn't stay there. Couldn't stand to look at the forge where I'd worked while they were alive. Couldn't sleep in the bed we'd shared. So I walked away. Sold everything, bought supplies and a horse, and headed into the mountains. That was 5 years ago. Been out here ever since, mostly alone, mostly by choice." He turned to look at her then, and his pale eyes held a depth of pain that made Martha's chest ache. "People in towns like Broken Ridge," Elias said, "they look at someone like you and see what's on the outside. They judge, they mock, they make you feel like you're less than human because you don't fit their narrow idea of what's acceptable. They did the same thing to Sarah, actually, before we married. Her family was poor, and she worked in a saloon serving drinks. Not a prostitute, just a serving girl, but people talked. Said she was tainted, ruined, not fit for decent society. I heard the whispers, saw how they treated her. And I loved her anyway. Married her anyway because I knew the truth about who she was." He picked up a stone and tossed it into the stream, watching the ripples spread. "When I saw that drunk fool mocking you, saw the way everyone laughed like your pain was entertainment, I saw Sarah. I saw how she used to shrink into herself when people whispered, and I thought not again. Not if I can stop it, so I did." Martha felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. "She was lucky to have you. I was the lucky one." Elias stood brushing dirt from his trousers. "Anyway, that's why. Not because I'm some kind of hero or saint, just because I've seen enough cruelty in this world to know I don't want to add to it. And I've learned that the people society rejects are often the ones worth knowing best." He extended his hand to help her up, and Martha took it, letting him pull her to her feet. There was an understanding between them now, a shared knowledge of loss and loneliness that needed no further explanation. "We should keep moving," Elias said. "Got a few more hours of daylight, and I want to make it to the high meadow before dark. There's a good camping spot there with a lean-to for shelter." They remounted Martha with slightly less awkwardness this time and continued up the trail. The trees grew denser, the air cooler as they climbed higher into the mountains. Martha's body ached, but she focused on the beauty around her, trying to absorb every detail of this new world she'd entered. She'd spent her entire life in towns, in buildings surrounded by walls and limitations. Out here, the sky seemed impossibly vast, the horizons endless. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, they emerged into a high meadow ringed by towering pines. A small stream bubbled through the center, and against the eastern edge stood a rough lean-to constructed of logs and branches. "This is it," Elias said, dismounting. "Not much, but it's dry and keeps the wind off. I stop here whenever I'm heading up to the cabin. He helped Martha down again, and this time her legs held steady beneath her. While Elias unsaddled the horses and set them to graze in the meadow, Martha explored the lean-to. It was simple but well constructed, with a fire pit lined with stones and a stack of dry wood protected under one corner. "You built this?" she asked when Elias joined her. "Over the years, yeah. A little bit each time I passed through. Figured it made sense to have a decent place to stop." He began arranging wood in the fire pit. "Can you gather some kindling, small stuff dry as you can find? Look under the trees where the rain doesn't reach." Martha set to work, grateful to have a task. She moved through the edge of the meadow, collecting small twigs and dried pine needles, occasionally stopping to look up at the darkening sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. By the time she returned to the lean-to, Elias had a fire burning its warm light, pushing back the gathering darkness. "Good eye," he said, examining her collection of kindling. "You picked dry stuff. Some people grab anything green and then wonder why their fire won't catch." He added her kindling to the flames, then pulled food from his saddlebag, more jerky, some dried apples, and a small tin of beans that he set to warm near the fire. "It's not fancy," he said, echoing his earlier words. "But up here, hot food is a luxury." They ate slowly, watching the fire dance and listening to the night sounds of the mountains, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of wind through pine branches, the occasional crack of a branch settling. Martha had never experienced such profound silence before. In town there was always noise, voices, footsteps, doors, slamming horses in the street. Out here the quiet was almost tangible, broken only by natural sounds that seemed to belong to the darkness rather than intrude upon it. "Are you afraid?" Elias asked suddenly. Martha considered the question carefully. "Yes," she admitted, "but not of what you might think. I'm not afraid of you or the wilderness or even of failing at the work you're offering. I'm afraid that I'll wake up tomorrow and discover this was all a dream, that I'm still in that tiny room in the boarding house and none of this really happened." "It happened," Elias said quietly. "You made it happen. You chose this." "I've never chosen anything before." "Not really. Every decision in my life has been made for me or made by necessity. This is the first time I've actively chosen something just because I wanted it." "How does it feel?" Martha smiled, surprised by the question and more surprised by her answer. "Terrifying and wonderful, both at the same time." Elias nodded as if this made perfect sense. "That's how you know it's worth doing. The things that matter most are always terrifying." He stood and retrieved bedrolls from the horses' packs, spreading one on each side of the fire. "You take that side," he said, pointing to the spot farthest from the opening of the lean-to. "It's warmer there, more protected. I'll take the outer edge." "You don't have to." "I do, actually. It's colder out here than you're used to, and you'll need every advantage until you acclimate. Besides, I'm used to sleeping light. If anything approaches the camp, I'll hear it first." The casual mention of things approaching the camp sent a small shiver down Martha's spine, but she didn't argue. She settled into the bedroll, which smelled of horse and leather and wood smoke, and pulled the blanket up to her chin. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the rough wooden walls of the lean-to. "Elias," Martha said into the darkness. "Yeah, thank you for giving me this chance, for seeing something in me worth taking a chance on." There was a long pause, and Martha thought perhaps he'd fallen asleep, but then his voice came through the darkness, quiet and firm. "You don't need to thank me, Martha. You earned this chance by having the courage to take it. That's all you, not me." Martha closed her eyes, listening to the fire and the night sounds and the quiet breathing of the man across from her. Despite the strangeness of her situation, despite sleeping on the ground in the wilderness, despite everything that had changed in the space of a single day, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt safe. The next morning dawned cold and bright frost glittering on the meadow grass like scattered diamonds. Martha woke to find Elias already up the fire-rebuilt coffee brewing in a battered pot. Her body ached in places she'd forgotten existed, her muscles protesting every movement as she struggled out of the bedroll. "Morning," Elias said, handing her a tin cup of coffee. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by horses." He laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his usually serious face. "That's about right. But you'll loosen up as we move. It's actually better to keep riding than to rest too long. Trust me on that. They broke camp efficiently, Elias showing Martha how to roll the bedding properly, how to douse the fire completely, how to leave no trace of their presence. It's respect, he explained. For the land and for whoever might use this spot next. We take what we need, we leave everything else as we found it. The second day of riding was harder than the first. Martha's sore muscles made mounting Molly an exercise in determination, and every step the mare took sent jolts of pain through her abused body. But she gritted her teeth and focused on staying in the saddle, on learning to move with the horse, rather than against it, on observing everything Elias did and trying to absorb his easy competence. The trail grew steeper, narrower, winding through dense forest, and across rocky outcroppings that fell away to dizzying drops. Martha tried not to look down, tried to trust Molly's sure-footedness, but her heart raced every time they skirted a particularly treacherous section. Around midday, they stopped to rest beside a small waterfall that tumbled down moss-covered rocks. While the horses drank, Elias pointed out various plants and features of the landscape. See those mushrooms growing on that dead log? Those are oyster mushrooms, edible and good fried up. And that plant there with the jagged leaves, that's wild mint, makes decent tea if you dry it properly. He moved to another spot, kneeling beside a cluster of plants with distinctive leaves. And these are what I really wanted to show you. Chanterelles like the ones I gave you in town. This is the time of year to harvest them before the first hard freeze. Martha climbed down from Molly, wincing at the stiffness in her legs, and joined him. Up close, the mushrooms were even more beautiful than she'd realized, their golden color, almost luminous against the dark forest floor. How do you know which ones are safe? She asked. Experience mostly, and being cautious. You never eat anything you're not absolutely certain about. He pulled a knife from his belt and carefully cut several mushrooms at the base, leaving the root structure intact. Cut them like this, see? You don't pull them up because that damages the mycelium, the root system that produces more mushrooms. You harvest respectfully, take only what you need, leave plenty for the forest and for next year. He handed her the knife. Your turn. Find some more, and show me how you'd harvest them. Martha searched carefully, finding several more clusters. She cut them the way Elias had shown her, trying to be precise and respectful. When she'd collected a handful, she brought them back for his inspection. Good, he said, examining her work. Clean cuts, roots intact. You learn quick. The simple praise warmed her more than it should have. Martha wrapped the mushrooms carefully in cloth and added them to the supplies. Then they continued their journey. As afternoon stretched toward evening, the character of the forest changed. The trees grew larger, older, their massive trunks covered in thick bark and trailing moss. The air itself felt different, cleaner, somehow, sharper, as if they'd climbed above the ordinary world into some more rarefied atmosphere. We're getting close, Elias said. Another hour, maybe less. Martha's exhaustion evaporated, replaced by a mixture of excitement and anxiety. For 2 days, she'd been traveling toward this unknown destination, this cabin in the mountains that would be her home for the winter. What would it be like? Would she be able to do the work Elias needed? Would she prove capable, or would she fail and confirm everything? Broken Ridge had always believed about her. The sun was touching the western peaks when they emerged from the forest into a clearing, and there, nestled against the mountainside, stood a cabin. It was larger than Martha had expected, built of logs chinked with mud and moss, with a stone chimney rising from one end. A covered porch ran along the front, and various tools hung from pegs on the wall: saws, traps, bundles of rope. Behind the cabin stood a lean-to stable for the horses and a small smokehouse. A garden plot, now brown and dormant, occupied a sunny patch to the south. This is it, Elias said, and Martha heard something in his voice that might have been pride or might have been relief. Home. He dismounted and helped Martha down, then led the horses to the stable while Martha stood in the clearing, slowly turning to take it all in. The cabin sat in a natural bowl surrounded by towering pines and aspens. A stream ran nearby. She could hear its cheerful burble, even if she couldn't see it through the trees. The view to the west was spectacular, with the mountains rolling away in layers of blue and purple toward the horizon. What do you think? Elias asked, rejoining her. It's beautiful, Martha said honestly. It's the most beautiful place I've ever seen. Something in Elias's expression softened. "Come on, I'll show you inside." The cabin's interior was dim after the brightness outside, but as Martha's eyes adjusted, she saw a single large room with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A sturdy table and chairs occupied the center, and various shelves and cabinets lined the walls filled with tools, supplies, and cooking implements. Furs and pelts hung from the rafters, and herbs dried in bundles beside the window. Everything was neat, organized, cared for with the attention of someone who lived alone and needed to know where everything was. "Your room is through there," Elias said, pointing to a door on the far wall. "Used to be a storage room, but I cleaned it out and built a bed frame. It's small, but it's private and it's yours." Martha pushed open the door and found a room barely larger than her space at the boarding house, but somehow completely different. A simple bed with a rope frame stood against one wall, already made up with blankets and furs. A small table held a wash basin and pitcher. Pegs on the wall offered space to hang clothes. And most surprisingly, there was a window, small but real, that looked out toward the mountains. "I know it's not much," Elias said from behind her, "but it's perfect," Martha interrupted. She turned to face him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Elias, it's perfect. It has a window, a real window." He looked puzzled. "Of course it has a window. How else would you get light?" "My room in Broken Ridge didn't have a window, just four walls and darkness. This—" She gestured helplessly at the small space. "This is more than I ever hoped for." Elias's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, understanding, and something that might have been anger on her behalf. "Then I'm glad I built it," he said finally. "Come on, let's get some food in you, and then I'll show you around the place properly tomorrow." That night they ate a simple meal of beans and cornbread while Elias explained the daily routines of mountain life. There was water to be hauled from the stream wood to be chopped and stacked for the winter meat, to be smoked vegetables, to be preserved herbs, to be dried, and endless repairs and preparations needed before the snow came in earnest. "It's a lot of work," he admitted. "I won't lie about that. But it's honest work and there's satisfaction in it. In knowing you've provided for yourself that you can survive without depending on anyone else." "I want to learn," Martha said. "Everything you're willing to teach me. I want to be useful to earn my keep." "You'll earn it," Elias assured her. "And Martha, one more thing. I know Mrs. Halpern docked your wages, and I know you wouldn't take my money in town, but I meant what I said about fair pay. I'll pay you monthly, same as I'd pay any hired help. You keep that money, it's yours. And if at any point you decide this isn't working, if you want to leave, I'll take you back to town or wherever you want to go. No questions, no judgment. You're here by choice, and you can leave by choice. Understand?" Martha nodded, too moved to speak. In the firelight, Elias's scarred face looked almost gentle, and she understood that beneath his rough exterior and fearsome reputation, he was perhaps the kindest man she'd ever met. "I understand," she said finally. "Thank you." "Stop thanking me. We're partners in this, equal partners. You do your share of the work, I do mine, and we both survive the winter better than we would alone. That's the arrangement." "Equal partners," Martha repeated, testing the words. They felt foreign, but right, like a language she'd always wanted to speak but had never been taught. That night in her small room with its precious window, Martha lay in bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the mountain wilderness. Wind in the trees, the distant cry of something wild, the crackle of the dying fire in the main room. And beneath it all, the deep silence that was somehow more comforting than any sound. She thought about Broken Ridge and Mrs. Halpern and the years she'd spent making herself small and invisible. She thought about her mother who died believing her daughter would never find a place in the world. And she thought about Elias sleeping in the main room who'd offered her not charity or pity, but opportunity and respect. Outside her window, the stars blazed in a sky unpolluted by town lights. Martha pressed her hand against the cool glass, feeling the vastness of the world beyond, and smiled into the darkness. She'd been terrified yesterday morning when she'd walked out of the boarding house with her small bag and enormous courage. She was still terrified, if she was honest. But it was a different kind of fear now, the fear that came with possibility rather than with despair. For the first time in her 26 years, Martha Winslow was exactly where she chose to be. And that made all the difference. Dawn came slowly to the mountains, the sun's first rays painting the peaks in shades of rose gold before spilling down into the valley where the cabin sat. Martha woke to the sound of an axe striking wood, steady, rhythmic, purposeful. She rose and dressed quickly in the cold morning air, her breath misting before her face, and emerged from her room to find the main cabin empty except for a fire already crackling in the hearth and coffee warming on the iron stove. Through the window she saw Elias at the woodpile, his shirt sleeves rolled despite the chill, his axe rising and falling with practiced precision. Each swing split logs cleanly adding to the growing stack beside the cabin. Martha poured herself coffee and stepped out onto the porch, wrapping her shawl tight against the morning cold. Elias looked up at her approach, pausing mid-swing. "Morning. Sleep well." "Better than I have in years," Martha admitted. "That bed is more comfortable than anything I've ever slept on. Good furs make all the difference up here." He set down the axe and wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold. "You ready to start learning?" "I am." "Then drink that coffee and come help me finish this wood. Winter's coming faster than usual this year. I can feel it in the air. We need at least 3 more cords stacked and covered before the first real snow hits." Martha had never split wood before, but Elias proved to be a patient teacher. He showed her how to read the grain of the wood, where to place the wedge, how to let the weight of the maul do most of the work, rather than relying on strength alone. Her first attempts were clumsy, the maul bouncing off the log or sticking halfway through, but gradually she found the rhythm. By mid-morning, her hands were blistered and her shoulders ached, but she'd split an entire log into usable pieces. "Good work," Elias said, examining her efforts. "You've got the determination for this life. That matters more than experience." They worked side by side through the morning, and Martha found herself watching Elias when she thought he wasn't looking. She noticed things she hadn't seen before, the way he moved with efficient grace, despite his size, the care he took with every task, the quiet contentment that seemed to settle over him when he worked with his hands. This was a man who'd found peace in solitude, who'd built a life from grief and made something sustainable from it. Around noon, Elias called a halt. "We need to check the traps I set last week. Good time for you to learn the trap lines. Bring that canteen and some jerky. We'll be gone most of the afternoon." They walked through the forest on narrow trails that Martha would never have noticed on her own, Elias pointing out landmarks and teaching her to read the land. "See that bent tree that marks the fork where the north trail splits? And those 3 rocks stacked together? I put those there 5 years ago to mark where the creek runs underground. Up here you have to be your own map." The first trap they checked was empty, but the second held a rabbit. Elias dispatched it quickly and humanely, then showed Martha how to reset the trap. "We take only what we need," he explained, "and we use everything meat for, even the bones for tools or soup stock. Nothing gets wasted." By the time they returned to the cabin, Martha's legs were trembling with exhaustion and her blistered hands throbbed, but she'd learned how to identify animal tracks, how to move quietly through the forest, how to read the subtle signs that indicated game trails and water sources. The knowledge felt precious, earned through effort and attention rather than simply told. That evening, Elias taught her how to skin and prepare the rabbit, talking through each step. "It seems hard at first, but your hands learn. After a while, you don't have to think about it. Your fingers just know what to do." He watched her work, offering occasional guidance, but mostly letting her figure it out. When she finished, he nodded approvingly. "Good. Clean work. Sarah used to say I had the patience of a mountain, but you've got the focus of one. That's better." They roasted the rabbit over the fire with wild herbs Elias had dried from summer, and the smell that filled the cabin made Martha's mouth water. When they finally sat down to eat, the meat was tender and flavorful, seasoned with sage and thyme, and something else Martha couldn't identify. "What's that other taste?" she asked between bites. "Wild garlic. Grows down by the stream in spring. I dig up the bulbs and preserve them for winter cooking." He paused, studying her across the table. "You're doing well, Martha. Better than I expected, honestly. Most people from town would have given up and demanded to go back by now." "I don't want to go back," Martha said firmly. "There's nothing for me there. This—" She gestured around the cabin at the simple room lit by firelight, at the life they were building together through labor and learning. "This feels real. Like I'm finally doing something that matters." It does matter. Every log we split, every animal we trap, every bit of food we preserve, it's all the difference between surviving winter and suffering through it. Up here, the work you do directly affects whether you live or die. There's a clarity to that, a purpose. Over the following days, Martha threw herself into learning everything Elias would teach her. She learned to identify edible mushrooms and roots, to set snares for small game, to smoke meat properly so it wouldn't spoil. She learned which herbs could treat common ailments, how to render fat for candles and soap, how to read the sky for weather changes. Her hands grew calloused, her muscles strengthened, and the constant ache in her body gradually transformed from pain into the pleasant soreness of useful labor. Elias proved to be more than just a teacher. He was a companion who treated her contributions with respect, who asked her opinion on decisions, who shared the work equally, rather than relegating her to traditionally feminine tasks, while he handled the real work. When they hunted together. When they cooked together. When decisions needed to be made about winter preparations, he presented the options and asked what she thought before proceeding. "What do you think?" became his most common phrase, and each time he said it, Martha felt something inside her strengthen. Her opinions mattered here. Her thoughts had value. She wasn't just a body to perform labor. She was a partner whose judgment was trusted. 3 weeks after their arrival, the first snow fell. Martha woke to find the world transformed, everything covered in a blanket of white that muffled sound and softened edges. She stood at her window watching flakes drift past and felt a surge of accomplishment. They were ready. The wood was stacked high and covered. The smokehouse was full of preserved meat. The root cellar held vegetables and mushrooms and dried herbs. They'd worked for this, earned this security through their own efforts. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Elias said from behind her, making her jump. She hadn't heard him approach. First snow always feels like a gift, a promise that you made it, that you prepared well enough to face what's coming. "We made it," Martha corrected gently. Elias smiled a real smile that reached his eyes. "Yeah, we did." That day marked a shift in their relationship. With the heavy preparation work done, they settled into the quieter rhythms of winter living. They still had chores, animals to feed, wood to haul, snow to clear from the paths. But there were also long evenings by the fire talking about their pasts and their dreams, playing card games with a worn deck Elias kept in a drawer, reading aloud from the few books he owned. Martha learned that Elias had been educated beyond what his rough exterior suggested. His father had been a schoolteacher before becoming a blacksmith, and he'd taught his son to read and write and think critically. Elias in turn had taught Sarah, who'd never had the opportunity for formal schooling. Now he shared that knowledge with Martha, correcting her grammar, gently introducing her to books she'd never have encountered in Broken Ridge, discussing ideas and philosophies that made her mind stretch in unfamiliar but exciting directions. "You're smart," he said one evening after a particularly spirited debate about a passage from Emerson. "Too smart to have been wasted serving meals to cowboys who couldn't appreciate you." "I didn't know I was smart," Martha admitted. "No one ever treated me like I was. I thought maybe I was just ordinary, or less than ordinary. You were surrounded by fools who couldn't see past their own prejudices. That's their failing, not yours." Elias leaned back in his chair, firelight playing across his scarred face. "You know what I see when I look at you? I see someone who had the courage to walk away from everything familiar, even though it was terrifying. I see someone who learns fast and works hard and doesn't complain when things are difficult. I see a woman who's stronger than she knows. That's not ordinary, Martha. That's remarkable." Martha felt her face heat, and she looked down at her hands, not knowing how to respond to such direct praise. In Broken Ridge, the only comments about her appearance or character had been cruel. Compliments were foreign territory, uncomfortable in their unfamiliarity. "I'm not trying to embarrass you," Elias said more quietly. "I just think you should know your own worth. You spent too many years listening to people who didn't know what they were talking about. Time you heard some truth." As winter deepened and the snow piled higher, Martha found herself increasingly comfortable in the cabin, in the routine they'd established in Elias's presence. He was easy to be around, quiet, when she needed quiet, conversational, when she wanted to talk, respectful of her space and privacy. He never made her feel crowded or threatened, never took advantage of their isolation or her dependence on him. He was simply kind, and kindness, Martha was learning, was the rarest and most valuable quality a person could possess. One evening in early December, they were preparing dinner together. Martha kneading dough for biscuits while Elias stirred a pot of venison stew when he said, "Can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Have you ever wanted to have a family?" Martha's hands stilled in the dough. It was a question that had haunted her for years, a dream she'd buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself it didn't exist. "I used to want that," she said carefully. "When I was younger, before I understood how the world saw me, I thought maybe someone would look past the outside and see something worth loving, but no one ever did. So I stopped wanting it, or I tried to anyway. It's hard to stop wanting something just because it's impossible." "It's not impossible," Martha laughed, but there was no humor in it. "For someone like me, it is. Men don't want women who look like me. Men want what they've been told to want," Elias interrupted. "But that doesn't mean they're right, and it doesn't mean all men want the same thing." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I've been thinking. About us. About this arrangement." Martha's heart began to pound. "What about it?" "When I offered you this job, I meant it. I needed help, and you needed an escape. That's all it was supposed to be. But these past weeks working alongside you, talking with you, watching you become more yourself instead of less. Martha, I've started to feel things I didn't expect to feel, things I didn't think I could feel anymore." Martha couldn't breathe. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't happen to her. "I loved Sarah," Elias continued. "I'll always love her. She was my wife, the mother of my daughter, and losing them nearly destroyed me. I came up here thinking I'd spend the rest of my life alone, that I'd never want or need anyone else. And then you walked into that boarding house and you looked at me like I was human instead of a monster, and something in me woke up." "Elias, let me finish, please." He set down the spoon and turned to face her fully. "I know this is fast. I know we've only known each other a few weeks, but up here, time moves different. When you work beside someone, depend on them, share your days and your thoughts and your struggles. You learn who they really are faster than you would in years of Sunday socials and chaperoned courtship. And what I've learned is that you're exactly the kind of person I want in my life, not just for the winter, for longer." Martha's vision blurred with tears. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want you to stay. Not as hired help, but as more. I'm saying that I'm falling in love with you, Martha Winslow, and I'd like the chance to see where that goes. I'm saying that when spring comes, I don't want you to leave. I want you to stay here with me, build a life with me, maybe even marry me if you'd consider it." The tears spilled over, running down Martha's cheeks. "Why would you want that? Why would you want me?" Elias crossed the space between them and took her flour-dusted hands in his. "Because you're kind and smart and brave. Because you make me laugh. Because you work beside me as an equal instead of expecting me to do everything while you watch. Because when I talk about Sarah and Emma, you don't get jealous or uncomfortable, you honor their memory by listening. Because you see the man I am instead of the monster people say I am. Because every day since you arrived, this cabin has felt less like a tomb and more like a home." "I'm not pretty," Martha whispered. "I'm not what men are supposed to want. You're beautiful to me. Your strength, your determination, your kindness, that's beauty. The rest is just flesh and bone, and it'll all fade eventually anyway. What's inside you, Martha, that's what matters. That's what lasts." He squeezed her hands gently. "I'm not asking for an answer right now. I know this is sudden, but I wanted you to know how I feel, what I'm hoping for. And I want you to think about whether maybe, just maybe, you might feel the same way." Martha looked up at him through her tears, at this man who'd defended her when no one else would, who'd offered her safety when she had none, who'd treated her with consistent respect and kindness, and now was offering her something she'd thought forever beyond her reach. Love, partnership, a future. "I already do," she said, her voice breaking. "Feel the same way, I mean. I've been trying to tell myself it was just gratitude or relief or desperation. But Elias, when I look at you, I don't see a mountain man or a killer or whatever stories they tell in town. I see someone who's been hurt and survived it. Someone who's built something meaningful from grief. Someone who's shown me more kindness in a few weeks than I received in 26 years. I see a man I could love. A man I think I already do love." Elias's scarred face broke into a smile of such pure joy that it transformed him completely. He pulled her into his arms, and Martha went willingly, pressing her face against his chest and feeling his heart beating strong and steady beneath her cheek. His arms came around her, enveloping her in warmth and safety, and something that felt impossibly like belonging. "I don't deserve this," she whispered against his shirt. "Yes, you do. You deserve everything good this world has to offer, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you get it." They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the firelit cabin, while the stew simmered and the biscuit dough sat forgotten on the table. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the mountains in white silence, but inside, something warm and vital had taken root. When they finally pulled apart, Elias cupped her face in his calloused hands and looked at her with such tenderness that Martha felt her heart might burst. "I want to do this right," he said, "old-fashioned and proper. So I'm asking Martha Winslow, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, my equal in all things?" "Yes," Martha breathed. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." Elias kissed her, then gentle, at first then deeper, with a passion that had been building for weeks, and finally had permission to exist. Martha kissed him back, tasting salt from her own tears and joy and the promise of a future she'd never dared to imagine. The next few weeks passed in a haze of happiness. They made plans discussing how they'd go to town in the spring to be married properly by a minister, how they'd expand the cabin to add more rooms, how they'd build a life together that honored both their pasts and their hopes for the future. Elias carved her a ring from a piece of oak, simple but beautiful, and placed it on her finger with a solemnity that made the moment feel as sacred as any church ceremony. "Until we can get a proper ring," he said, "but I wanted you to have something now, something that marks you as mine and me as yours." Martha wore the wooden ring with more pride than she'd have worn diamonds. It represented everything they'd built together, something created from nothing, transformed through care and attention and love into something valuable and lasting. The work of winter continued, but now it had a different quality. Every log Martha split was for their home. Every meal she prepared was for their family. Every evening by the fire was a glimpse of their future decades of evenings, just like this growing old together, building memories, creating a legacy of love that would outlast them both. One afternoon in late December, they were checking the trap lines together when Elias stopped, suddenly holding up his hand for silence. Martha froze, following his gaze through the trees. There, perhaps 50 yards away, stood a magnificent buck, his antlers wide and proud, his coat thick with winter growth. Elias raised his rifle with practiced smoothness, but Martha touched his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "Look at him. He's so beautiful." Elias lowered the rifle slightly, watching the deer. "We could use the meat. We have enough. We have more than enough. Let him live. Let him be beautiful." Elias looked at her for a long moment, then slowly lowered the rifle completely. They stood together in the snow, watching the buck until he moved off through the trees, graceful and free. When he disappeared, Elias took Martha's hand. "You've changed me," he said quietly. "Before you came, I saw everything in terms of utility, what could be used, what could be harvested, what could serve a purpose. But you've reminded me that some things are valuable just for being what they are, that beauty has purpose too." "You've changed me as well," Martha said. "You've shown me that I can be strong, that I have value beyond what others decide I'm worth. You've given me a life, Elias, a real life, not just survival." They returned to the cabin hand in hand, and that evening, sitting by the fire, Elias pulled out a worn leather journal. "This was Sarah's," he said, running his fingers over the cover. "She kept it for Emma, writing down stories and thoughts and things she wanted to tell our daughter when she was older. After they died, I couldn't bear to look at it. But recently I've been reading it again, and I think Sarah would want me to share it with you, would want you to know her through her own words." Martha took the journal with reverent hands, understanding the trust this represented. That night she read Sarah's words, her thoughts on love and motherhood, her dreams for her daughter's future, her gratitude for a husband who saw her worth when others didn't. And Martha understood why Elias had loved this woman and why he could love again. Sarah's words didn't make Martha jealous or inadequate. Instead, they made her feel connected to a woman she'd never met, part of a lineage of women who'd been underestimated and had proven the world wrong. "She sounds wonderful," Martha said when she'd finished reading. She was. And she'd have liked you, I think. She believed that people who'd suffered were capable of the deepest kindness because they knew what it cost. Elias took the journal back and set it carefully aside. "I'm not trying to replace her with you, Martha. I want you to know that. You're not a substitute. You're something new, something different, something uniquely yours. My love for Sarah doesn't diminish what I feel for you. If anything, loving her taught me how to love well, how to appreciate what I have while I have it." "I understand," Martha said, "and I'm honored to share your heart with her memory. She was part of making you who you are, and who you are is the man I love." As winter deepened toward the darkest days of the year, Martha felt herself transforming in ways that had nothing to do with physical labor. The woman who'd left Broken Ridge had been bent by years of cruelty, diminished by constant dismissal, half convinced that she deserved the treatment she received. But the woman who sat by the fire in a mountain cabin, wearing a wooden engagement ring and planning a future with a man who treasured her, was someone different, someone stronger. Someone who'd learned that her worth wasn't determined by others' opinions, but by her own actions, her own choices, her own courage. On Christmas Eve, they sat together by the fire, roasting chestnuts Elias had traded for in town the previous fall. Snow fell heavy outside, but inside they were warm and safe and utterly content. "What are you thinking about?" Elias asked, watching her face in the firelight. "I'm thinking about how much my life has changed. 6 months ago, I couldn't have imagined any of this, and now I can't imagine going back to who I was before." "You don't have to go back. You only have to keep moving forward, with me if you'll have me." Martha leaned her head against his shoulder. "Always. Always," Elias echoed, wrapping his arm around her. "That's a promise I can keep." Outside, the wind howled, and the temperature dropped. But in the cabin, where two wounded souls had found each other, where a woman once scorned had discovered her strength, and a man once broken had learned to love again. There was only warmth and light, and the quiet certainty that they'd both finally come home. Winter held the mountains in its grip through January, and into February the snow piling so high that the cabin windows were half buried and the world beyond their clearing seemed to disappear entirely. But Martha had never felt less trapped. Each morning she woke in her small room with its precious window, now frosted with intricate ice patterns, and felt a surge of gratitude so intense it nearly hurt. This life, this place, this man who loved her, it was more than she'd ever dared to hope for. On a bitter cold morning in mid-February, Martha was kneading bread dough at the table while Elias repaired a snowshoe by the fire. The domestic quiet between them had become comfortable, companionable, punctuated by easy conversation and shared smiles. Martha had just shaped the dough into loaves when Elias suddenly straightened his head, tilted toward the door. "Someone's coming," he said quietly, setting aside the snowshoe and rising to his feet. "Coming here in this weather?" Martha wiped flour from her hands, her heart beginning to race. They hadn't seen another soul since the snow had started falling in earnest 3 months ago. 3 horses, maybe 4, moving slow through the deep snow. Elias moved to the window, peering out through a gap in the frost. His jaw tightened. "They're heading straight for the cabin." Martha joined him at the window, straining to see through the white landscape. Eventually she made out dark shapes moving between the trees, men on horseback wrapped in heavy coats pushing through snow that reached their horses' chests. "Do you know them?" she asked. "Can't tell yet, but nobody comes up here in winter unless they're desperate or looking for trouble." Elias moved to the wall where his rifle hung. He checked it methodically, then pulled down his pistol and knife as well. "Martha, I need you to go to your room and bolt the door from inside." "No." The word came out stronger than she'd intended. "I'm not hiding while you face whatever this is alone. We're partners, remember, equal partners." Elias turned to look at her, and something flickered in his pale eyes. Pride perhaps mixed with concern. "If these men mean trouble, then we face it together." Martha's voice was steady, despite her racing pulse. She'd spent too many years cowering, too many years letting fear control her choices. She'd found her strength in these mountains, and she wasn't about to lose it now. "Where's that second rifle you were teaching me to shoot?" For a long moment, Elias studied her face. Then he nodded slowly and retrieved the smaller rifle from the cabinet, checking it before handing it to her. Remember what I taught you. Don't point it at anything you're not willing to shoot. Keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to fire. And Martha, stay behind me until we know what we're dealing with. I will. The riders emerged into the clearing a few minutes later. 4 men, their horses steaming in the cold air, their faces partially hidden by scarves and hat brims. They stopped about 20 yards from the cabin, and one of them raised his hand in what might have been a greeting or might have been a command to halt. Elias stepped out onto the porch, rifle held casually but ready. Martha followed, positioning herself slightly behind him, but still visible, her own rifle held with the confidence he'd taught her. The cold bit through her wool dress immediately, but she ignored it. That's far enough, Elias called out, his voice carrying across the snow. State your business. The lead rider pushed back his scarf, revealing a weathered face with a crooked nose and calculating eyes. Martha recognized him immediately. Jeb Crow, a trapper who occasionally came through Broken Ridge, known for his mean temper and tendency to start fights when drunk.
Well, Crow said, his breath misting in the frigid air. If it ain't the mountain man himself. And look what he's got with him, the fat girl from Halpern's place. Heard you two ran off together. Didn't believe it, but here's the proof. You've seen us. Now you can leave. Elias's voice was flat dangerous. Now hold on. That ain't very friendly, especially after we rode all this way. Crow gestured to his companions. We're just looking for a place to warm up, maybe get a hot meal. Winter's been harder than expected, and our supplies are running low. There's a settlement 2 days south. Go there. 2 days is a long way in this snow, and we're right here. Crow's eyes moved to Martha, and his smile turned cruel. Besides, we wanted to see for ourselves. The whole town's been talking about it, how the mountain man took pity on the ugliest woman in Wyoming. How she must have been so desperate she followed him up here like a dog. How you probably keep her around for entertainment since there's nothing else to do in winter. Martha felt the words like physical blows, each one designed to wound, to diminish, to send her scurrying back into the shame she'd worked so hard to escape. Her grip tightened on the rifle, but before she could speak, Elias's voice cut through the cold air like a blade. You've got about 10 seconds to turn those horses around and ride out of here before I put a bullet through you. That's not very neighborly, Crow said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. The other 3 men shifted nervously in their saddles, clearly having second thoughts about this expedition. I'm not your neighbor. This is my land and you're trespassing. 5 seconds. We just want 3 seconds. Crow's hand moved toward the pistol at his hip and everything seemed to slow down. Martha saw Elias's rifle come up with practiced speed, saw his finger move to the trigger, saw the cold certainty in his eyes that said he would absolutely shoot this man if necessary. But before anyone could fire, Martha stepped forward, her own rifle raised and pointed directly at Crow. Don't, she said, and her voice was steady, clear, ringing with authority she hadn't known she possessed. Don't make this mistake. Just turn around and leave, now. Crow looked at her, surprise flickering across his face. You gonna shoot me, fat girl? You even know how to use that thing. Elias taught me, and he's a very good teacher. Martha's hands didn't waver. I can hit a target at 50 yards. You're only 20 yards away. So yes, Mr. Crow, I know how to use this rifle. And I will use it if you don't leave. This is our home. You're not welcome here. The emphasis on "our" wasn't lost on anyone. Crow's expression darkened, but one of his companions, a younger man who looked increasingly uncomfortable, spoke up. Come on, Jeb. This was a bad idea. Let's just go. Yeah, another man added. We got no quarrel here. Let's head to that settlement he mentioned. Crow stared at Martha for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. She stared back, refusing to drop her gaze or lower her rifle. She'd spent too many years letting men like him make her feel worthless. She'd found her power now, her voice, her right to defend what was hers. And she wasn't backing down. Finally, Crow spat into the snow and jerked his horse's head around. Fine. Come on, boys. Ain't nothing here worth freezing our asses off for anyway. But as he turned, he couldn't resist one more jab. Enjoy your winter with the mountain man, fat girl, but don't think this changes anything. Come spring, when you come crawling back to civilization, everyone's going to know exactly what you are. I know exactly what I am, Martha called after him, and there was steel in her voice now, forged in the fire of survival and tempered by love. I'm a woman who knows her worth. I'm a woman who chose her own path. I'm a woman who found someone who sees her for who she really is, not what small-minded fools think she should be. And I'm a woman who will defend what's mine. That's what I am, Mr. Crow. The question is, do you know what you are? Crow didn't answer, just kicked his horse into motion. The four riders disappeared into the trees, moving back the way they'd come, their shapes gradually swallowed by the white landscape. Elias and Martha stood on the porch until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely, until the only sounds were wind in the pines and their own breathing. Then Elias carefully took the rifle from Martha's shaking hands and set both weapons aside. He pulled her into his arms, and she felt his heart hammering against her cheek. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Maybe both." "I wasn't going to let them—" Martha's voice broke. Now that the danger had passed, reaction was setting in. Her whole body trembled. "I wasn't going to hide while they threatened you, while they mocked us. This is our life, our home. I had to defend it." "You did. You absolutely did." Elias pulled back to look at her, his scarred face fierce with pride and love. "Martha, you were magnificent. You stood there like a warrior, like you'd been defending homesteads your whole life. I've never been more proud of anyone." I was terrified. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite the fear. You did that today. You defended me the same way I defended you that night in the boarding house. Equal partners, remember. "Equal partners," Martha echoed, and despite the lingering adrenaline, she smiled.
"We're quite the pair, aren't we? The mountain man and the woman everyone thought was worthless. The two people who found each other when they needed it most," Elias corrected. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the calloused roughness of his skin. "Listen to me. What that man said, those words he tried to use to hurt you, they're meaningless. You know that, right? You're not what they say you are. You're what you choose to be, and you've chosen to be strong, brave, capable. You've chosen to be my partner, my equal, my love. That's the truth. Everything else is just noise." Martha leaned into his touch, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones. She'd spent so many years carrying other people's judgments, letting their cruelty define her reality. But standing here in the snow, having just defended her home and her love with a rifle in her hands and steel in her spine, she finally understood that she'd shed that old skin completely. The woman she'd been in Broken Ridge was gone. This new woman, the one who could split wood and set traps and stand up to armed men, this was who she really was. This was who she'd always had the potential to be. "I love you." She said the words simple but profound. "I love you, Elias Greywood, and I love the woman I've become with you. Thank you for seeing her before I could see her myself. I love you too, Martha Winslow, soon to be Martha Greywood if you'll still have me. Always." They went back inside where the fire still crackled and the bread dough still waited to be baked, and everything was exactly as they'd left it. But something had fundamentally changed. Martha had been tested and had not been found wanting. She'd faced her fears and her past, and had emerged victorious, not because Elias had saved her, but because she'd saved herself. Saved them both, really, through her courage and determination. That evening, as they sat by the fire, eating fresh bread and the last of the venison stew, Elias reached across the table and took her hand. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the future, about what comes next." "What comes next?" "Spring, when the snow melts and the pass is open. I want to take you to town, not Broken Ridge, somewhere bigger, maybe Cheyenne or Laramie, and marry you properly. With a minister and witnesses and a real wedding. I want to buy you a proper ring, not just the wooden one I carved. I want to give you everything you deserve." "I already have everything I deserve," Martha said softly. "I have you. I have this cabin, this life, this chance to be who I really am. What more could I need? Children, maybe. A family, if you want that." Elias's voice was tentative, vulnerable in a way she rarely heard. "I know I'm older than you. I know I've already had a family and lost them. But with you, I find myself hoping again. Imagining a little girl with your gray eyes or a boy with your stubbornness. Is that something you'd want?" Martha felt tears prick her eyes. She'd given up on the idea of children years ago, accepting that marriage and motherhood weren't meant for women like her. But now sitting across from this man who loved her, imagining a cabin full of children who would grow up knowing they were valued and loved, regardless of how they looked or what society thought of them, it was almost too much to bear. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I want that. I want everything with you, Elias, every dream, every possibility, every ordinary day and extraordinary moment. I want all of it." "Then you'll have it, I promise you." As winter began its slow retreat toward spring, Martha and Elias settled into their final weeks of isolation with a deepened sense of partnership and purpose. They made plans for expanding the cabin, for planning a larger garden, for building a life that could accommodate a growing family. They talked about teaching their children to read and write, to trap and hunt, to value strength of character over superficial appearance. They imagined a future bright with possibility. One morning in early March, Martha woke to the sound of dripping water. She rose and looked out her window to see icicles melting in the sunlight, water running in rivulets down the cabin walls. Spring was coming. The long winter that had cocooned them in isolation and intimacy was drawing to a close. She found Elias already outside studying the snow depth in the sky. 2 weeks, he said when she joined him. Maybe 3. Then the pass will be clear enough to travel. We can head to Cheyenne, get married, pick up supplies, and be back before planting season. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Martha asked, the old insecurity raising its head one last time. Once we're married, you're bound to me. People will talk. They'll say you made a mistake, that you could have done better. Elias turned to her, and his expression was so fierce, so certain, that it took her breath away. Listen to me carefully, Martha Winslow, because I'm only going to say this once more. I have never made a better decision than bringing you into my life. You are smart, strong, capable, and kind. You work harder than anyone I've ever met. You face challenges without complaint. You've brought laughter and conversation and love back into a life I thought was over. Any man would be lucky to have you, and I'm the one who gets to. So no, I'm not having second thoughts. The only thought I'm having is how soon I can make you my wife. Martha threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. I'm so glad you walked into that boarding house, she said, her voice muffled by his shirt. I'm so glad you saw me. I'm glad you were brave enough to see me too, to see past the scars and the stories and the reputation. We saved each other, Martha. That's what makes this work. The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of activity. They prepared for the journey to Cheyenne, repairing tack and checking supplies, making sure the cabin would be secure in their absence. Martha practiced her riding daily, building up her endurance for the long journey ahead. And through it all, she felt a growing excitement, a sense that her real life, the life she was meant to live, was finally beginning. On their last evening before departure, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The snow was still deep, but patches of brown earth were beginning to show through, promises of the green that would follow. Tell me something, Martha said, leaning against Elias's shoulder. That first night when you walked into the boarding house and everyone went quiet, were you afraid of them? No, I stopped being afraid of other people's opinions a long time ago, but I was afraid of something else. What? I was afraid I'd forgotten how to be human, how to connect with people, to care about anything beyond simple survival. I'd been alone so long, I wasn't sure I could be any other way. He paused, his arm tightening around her. And then you served me dinner, and you looked at me with kindness instead of fear, and something in me remembered what it felt like to be seen as a person instead of a monster. You gave that back to me, Martha. You reminded me I was still human. We're a fine pair of rescuers then, both saving each other without even meaning to. The best kind of rescue, the kind where nobody has to be weak for it to work, where two people meet as equals and make each other stronger. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge brilliant and countless in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, not threatening, just calling out to its pack, a reminder that even the wildest creatures sought connection and belonging. I'm ready, Martha said finally, for whatever comes next. For Cheyenne, for marriage, for building our future. I'm not afraid anymore. Neither am I. The journey to Cheyenne took 6 days through melting snow and muddy trails. Martha's riding had improved dramatically, and she handled Molly with confidence, now navigating treacherous passages without fear. They camped under the stars, talking late into the night about their hopes and dreams, about the children they hoped to have, about the legacy they wanted to build. When they finally rode into Cheyenne, a bustling city of several thousand people, Martha felt overwhelmed by the noise and crowds after months of mountain silence. But Elias stayed close, his steady presence anchoring her as they navigated streets and shops and bureaucracy. They found a minister willing to perform the ceremony, a kind-faced man who asked no intrusive questions and seemed genuinely pleased to join them in marriage. They found a jeweler who had a simple gold band that fit Martha's finger perfectly. And they found a boarding house nothing like Halpern's establishment, but clean and respectful, where they could stay until the wedding. On the morning of their wedding day, Martha dressed in a new blue dress they'd purchased at the general store. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and well made, and when she looked at herself in the boarding house mirror, she saw a woman transformed. Gone was the defeated, diminished person who'd served meals in Broken Ridge. In her place stood someone confident, loved, certain of her place in the world. The ceremony was simple, held in a small church with only the minister's wife and another couple as witnesses. But when Elias took her hand and spoke his vows, promising to love and honor and cherish her for all their days, Martha felt the profound weight and beauty of the moment. This man, this strong, scarred, gentle man, had chosen her, not from desperation or pity, but from genuine love and respect. When it was her turn to speak, Martha's voice was clear and strong. I promise to be your partner in all things, to work beside you, to support you, to challenge you when you need it, and comfort you when you hurt. I promise to honor the memory of those you've loved and lost, and to build a future worthy of their legacy. I promise to be brave, to be kind, to be true. I promise to love you with everything I am for as long as I live. The minister pronounced them husband and wife. And when Elias kissed her, Martha felt the final pieces of her old life fall away completely. She was no longer Martha Winslow, the fat girl from Halpern's boarding house. She was Martha Greywood, wife and partner and woman of worth. They stayed in Cheyenne for 3 more days, purchasing supplies for the growing season and enjoying the novelty of sleeping in a real bed and eating food they hadn't prepared themselves. But by the 4th day, they were both eager to return to the mountains, to their cabin, to the life they'd built together. The journey back seemed shorter somehow, filled with easy conversation and shared laughter. When they finally emerged into the clearing where the cabin stood, both of them sighed with relief. Home, Martha said simply. Home, Elias echoed. That evening, as they unpacked supplies and settled back into their routine, Martha stood at the window of what was now their bedroom. They decided to share the larger space, turning her old room into a future nursery, and looked out at the mountains silhouetted against the darkening sky. What are you thinking about? Elias asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. I'm thinking about how far I've come. Not just in distance, but in who I am. 6 months ago, I was convinced my life would never be more than surviving one day after another, enduring cruelty, hoping for nothing because hope hurt too much. And now, she placed her hands over his. Now I have everything. A home, a husband, a future full of possibility. I'm not just surviving anymore, Elias. I'm living, really truly living. You're thriving. There's a difference. Surviving is just not dying. Living is finding purpose. And thriving. He turned her around to face him, his pale eyes soft in the lamplight. Thriving is what happens when you find your place in the world and bloom there. That's what you've done, Martha. You've bloomed. We've bloomed. Together. Together, he agreed. As spring advanced and the mountains came alive with green growth and running water, Martha and Elias fell into the rhythms of their new life. They planted the garden together, expanded the cabin together, made love in the big bed they now shared, and talked late into the night about their dreams. By midsummer, Martha suspected she might be pregnant, and the joy on Elias's face when she told him was brighter than the sun. One warm July evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset behind the western peaks, Martha reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her here. From the boarding house where she'd been invisible and mocked to this mountain paradise where she was cherished and valued. From believing she was worthless to knowing her own strength. From despair to hope to joy. Thank you, she said suddenly. Elias looked at her quizzically. For what? For being brave enough to defend me that night, for seeing something in me worth defending, for offering me this chance. Martha, you're still thanking me, after everything. Elias shook his head with amusement. If anything, I should be thanking you. You brought life back to this cabin, to these mountains, to my heart. You gave me a reason to hope again, to plan for a future, instead of just enduring the present. You defended me today, same as I defended you that night. We're equal in this, remember. Equal partners, Martha said, smiling. Equal partners, Elias confirmed. Two people who were broken by life and found each other. Two people who refused to let the world define them. Two people who built something beautiful from nothing but courage and love. As the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, Martha leaned her head on her husband's shoulder and closed her eyes, feeling utterly content. She thought about Jeb Crow and his cruel words about Mrs. Halpern and Broken Ridge, and all the people who'd dismissed her, who'd told her she was less than human because of her appearance. They'd been wrong. So completely, utterly wrong. She wasn't less than anything. She was exactly enough. She was strong and capable and worthy of love. She'd proven it by walking away from everything familiar, by learning to survive in the wilderness, by standing with a rifle in her hands and defending her home. She'd proven it by choosing courage over fear, by believing she deserved better and having the strength to reach for it. And Elias, scarred, solitary, fierce Elias, had been right there beside her, not saving her, but standing with her as an equal. Two outcasts who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances. Two broken souls who'd discovered they weren't broken at all, just waiting for the right person to see their worth. As snow began to fall outside their cabin months later, the first snow of their second winter together, Martha sat by the fire with her hand resting on her swelling belly, feeling the flutter of new life growing inside her. Elias sat across from her, carving a cradle from pine wood, his scarred face peaceful and content. "What do you think she'll be like?" Martha asked, watching him work. They'd agreed the baby would be a girl, though they had no way of knowing for certain. Smart like her mother, brave like her mother, kind like her mother. Elias looked up with a smile, and stubborn as hell like her mother. "I'm not stubborn. I'm determined." Same thing, different words. Martha laughed, the sound warm and free in the firelit cabin. Outside the wind howled and the snow fell, but inside there was only warmth and love and the quiet certainty that they'd both finally found what they'd been searching for. Not rescue, not salvation, not someone to complete them or fix them. Just a partner, an equal. Someone who saw their worth and reflected it back, who stood beside them in the fire and the snow, who chose them every day. Not from obligation, but from love. And that Martha thought as she watched her husband carve a cradle for their child, as she felt new life moving inside her, as she looked around at the home they'd built together from nothing but hope and hard work that was worth more than all the approval of every town, every society, every person who'd ever judged her and found her wanting. She'd found her place, not in Broken Ridge or Cheyenne or any town on any map, but here in these mountains with this man and this life they'd chosen together. She'd found her worth, not in others' opinions or society's standards, but in her own strength, her own courage, her own capacity to love and be loved. And she'd found her voice, not the quiet, apologetic whisper of survival, but the clear, strong sound of a woman who knew exactly who she was and wasn't afraid to defend it. The woman once scorned and the man once feared sat together as the fire burned low and the snow piled high, two souls who'd found peace not from what the world saw in them, but from what they saw in each other. And in that seeing, in that mutual recognition of worth and strength and beauty, they'd built something that would last far longer than any winter, any hardship, any cruelty the world could throw at them. They'd built a love that was equal, honest, and true, and that was everything.